In this video, we will be covering the female reproductive system once again, but specifically looking at oogenesis, which is the production of egg cells, comparing it with spermatogenesis, and then looking at the ovarian and the menstrual cycles. So oogenesis, again, is the production of the female gamete, which is called the ova or the ovum, or sometimes just called the egg cell. The oogenesis begins in the fetal period, so meaning when the female is first being developed in the womb of her mother, she is developing those eggs. The oogonia, which is the stem cell, begins mitosis, and this produces those additional egg cells, and then later that will lead to the production of the primary oocyte, and then the meiosis of those will lead to the secondary oocyte, which will lead ultimately to the ovum. So we're going to be talking about that whole process and when and how that occurs. So looking at the follicle also, just understanding the ova's relationship to the follicle. The ovarian follicle is a functional unit of the ovary, and it's think of it as like an eggshell almost. It encloses the oocyte, and before ovulation, the primary oocyte is inside this follicle, and then it's going to resume the process of meiosis, and so that primary oocyte will become secondary oocyte. There you can see that. We'll talk about this other thing in just a second. So this becomes the secondary oocyte, and then only a small portion of these follicles are then recruited into a pool, and there's kind of like a pool of follicles that will actually be used and follicles that will actually just not be used and kind of die and be reabsorbed. And so a follicle has one of two fates. One of those fates is called atresia, which is just basically apoptosis or programmed cell death. The follicle is never recruited. And of course, then the other destination would be ovulation. Each month or so after puberty, one of these follicles is released, and or one of these oocytes is released, and the follicle is left behind. We'll talk more about that in a second. So looking at the products of this process in females, so again, that dominant follicle is going to resume meiosis just before ovulation. And after the first division is completed, this meiosis 1, you will have two products. You will have a secondary oocyte, which is the product that will eventually become the egg. And you have another thing called a polar body. This polar body is a really small cell. It's basically devoid of cytoplasm altogether and will kind of be reabsorbed back into the body. The secondary oocyte is going to basically arrest itself in metaphase 2, as you can see there, and it will wait until fertilization. Once fertilization occurs, then meiosis will complete and it will become the full-on egg after fertilization, and then those two nuclei will combine and will form the zygote. If fertilization does not occur, this secondary oocyte basically deteriorates into, just gets reabsorbed back into the body. And you can see here that after fertilization, a second polar body is also made. And so that's important distinction here, is that meiosis 2 isn't completed until after fertilization occurs. So let's look at the differences between these two processes. Basically, a big difference is the number of gametes. For spermatogenesis, there's going to be 4 functional gametes that are produced for sperm cells, whereas in oogenesis, there's only 1 functional gamete that is created, and then there are those polar bodies that are made also. And spermatogenesis occurs basically from puberty all the way into old age, and it's a non-cyclic kind of process, whereas oogenesis begins during development back in the fetal stages, and the release of those eggs begins at puberty and ends at a time called menopause, when the female will stop releasing those eggs. And so, looking at that process now, there's two cycles that are kind of work together during this phase. The average length of these two cycles is 28 days. And again, they're working at the same time and even need one another. And so we'll look into that. First part of the first half that we'll look at is the ovarian cycle. It's basically divided into two phases. There is the follicular phase, which is days 1 through 14, and the luteal phase, which is days 14 through 28. Need to note that in between those 2 days, and basically the demarcation between those 2 days, is ovulation, which is the actual release of the ovum. So during the follicular phase, GnRH from the hypothalamus is released, which stimulates the release of follicle stimulating hormone from the pituitary, and that follicle stimulating hormone interacts with the ovaries, and those follicles in the ovary are stimulated to begin growing. After 14 days or so, there is the ovulation around day 14 that occurs because of the buildup of that follicle stimulating hormone. And then you have the luteal phase. And so the luteal phase happens after ovulation, and the ruptured follicle collapses and forms what's called a corpus luteum. It's basically like an empty eggshell. It's kind of the way of thinking about it. Here's your full follicle, the egg releases, and you have this empty eggshell. The corpus luteum is secreting a product called progesterone, and we'll talk about its purpose in a moment as well. But basically, if no pregnancy occurs, the corpus luteum will completely degenerate and the cycle will start over. If pregnancy occurs, the corpus luteum produces hormones that basically trick the brain into thinking that the cycle is not over and so that basically sustains the pregnancy until the placenta has time to grow and takes over. It's about a 3-month or so process. You pair this with the menstrual cycle, or sometimes you'll see this called the uterine cycle. Actually, I think uterine cycle is probably used more frequently now, but it's basically has to do with the lining of the uterus, namely the endometrium. And the endometrium, there's 3 parts to this. Days 1 through 5 is called the menstrual phase. Days 6 through 14 is called the proliferative phase. And days 15 through 28 are called the secretory phase. Sometimes you'll see proliferative called pre-ovulatory and secretory post-ovulatory. Those two things are divided by that act of ovulation once again. So in days 1 through 5 in the menstrual phase, the endometrium is shed out of the uterus, and by day 5, that ovarian follicle that is being developed is starting to produce estrogen. Well, that estrogen production is going to prompt the beginning of this next phase. We'll see this in the next slide. I can actually just go there because it kind of makes sense. All right. So as estrogen builds, you can see the building of estrogen starts this proliferative phase, and then it will get to a peak, and this will stimulate ovulation to occur. And so ovulation around day 14. And then after that, you have the secretory phase, and then rising progesterone from the corpus luteum is going to stimulate the secretory phase. And basically, what it does is the lining of the uterus that has been made, the new endometrium that has been produced during the proliferative phase, is going to start secreting a kind of some nutrients and things to prepare for the fetus. If fertilization occurs, then the uterus will receive the fertilized egg and begin the process of forming the placenta. And if the fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum degenerates completely and progesterone levels fall. The brain will then receive the fact that there's no longer estrogen or progesterone being produced, and then that is the trigger that causes the brain to release GnRH and start the whole cycle over again.